called my daughter before I even got my coat on. She didn't answer. I tried again. Nothing. So I did what any mother would do. I grabbed my keys, told my husband I'd be back by supper, and drove the 40 minutes from Oakville to the Pearson arrivals terminal without knowing exactly what I was walking into. I knew enough. She had sent me 3 words at 6:47 that morning. Come get me. That was all. No explanation, no follow-up text when I called back. Just those 3 words and then silence. And I had been a mother long enough to know that silence like that means the kind of hurt that doesn't fit in a message. I found her standing outside door 3 with my grandson on her hip and 2 duffel bags at her feet. He was 4 years old and wearing the same little blue jacket I'd sent him for Christmas. She was wearing sunglasses inside, which she only does when she's been crying and doesn't want anyone to notice. I didn't say anything at first. I just popped the trunk and loaded the bags. Then I walked around to her side and held out my arms from my grandson, and she handed him over. And I held him for a long moment, his small arms around my neck, and I could feel her watching me and trying very hard not to fall apart. Get in the car, I said. She did. We were on the 427 heading south before she said anything. My grandson had fallen asleep against the window with his mouth open, the way small children do when they've been up too early, and the world has already worn them out. She fired me, my daughter said. I kept my eyes on the road. She called HR herself, filed a complaint, said I'd created a hostile work environment. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I've worked there for 6 years. I never once. She stopped, started again. She told them I'd been undermining the leadership team, that I'd been going to clients behind management's back. Her mother-in-law owned the company, a mid-sized property management firm in Calgary, the kind of business that had been in the family for 2 generations and ran on reputation and personal loyalty and the unspoken rule that you did not cross the woman who signed the checks. My daughter had been their head of client relations. She built half their residential portfolio from scratch. And your husband? I said, carefully. The silence that followed told me most of what I needed to know. He said he needed time to process it. He needed time to process its mother firing his wife. He said it was complicated, that there were things about the business he couldn't explain to me, that maybe, she pressed her lips together, that maybe I should take some time away, let things settle. I didn't say what I was thinking. There would be time for that later. She said I could keep the apartment until the end of the month, my daughter continued, but that since I was no longer an employee, my access to the company health benefits would be terminated immediately, and that she thought it would be better for everyone, including, her voice broke for the first time, including my son, if he stayed with them for now, just temporarily, while I got myself sorted. I looked at my grandson sleeping against the window. She took him this morning before I was even fully awake, she said. Her and his grandmother. They came to the apartment at 7 and she said she was taking him to daycare and she'd have him back by dinner. And then at noon, she texted me and said he was staying with her, that she'd spoken to a family lawyer, that until I had stable employment and housing, it might be in his best interests. She finally took her sunglasses off. Her eyes were red along the edges, and she looked younger than she had in years. Or maybe older, I couldn't tell which. I have nothing, she said. I have 2 bags and my phone, and I don't even have a job anymore. I have nothing left. I merged onto the QEW, and I thought about what to say, and in the end, I said the only true thing. You have me. Here is what my daughter didn't know about me. What almost no one knew about me, because I had never been the kind of woman who talked about money. My late first husband, her father, had been a civil engineer. We were married for 19 years before he passed. And in that time, he had been careful and methodical and a little boring in exactly the way that turns out to matter. He had invested well. He had believed in property and patience. When he died, he left me the house in Oakville, a portfolio of rental properties across the Hamilton and Burlington corridor, and a commercial building on Lakeshore Road that I had since then added to twice. I had remarried. A good, quiet man who made excellent chili and read history books and had no interest in anyone's finances. And I had continued to manage everything myself. I used a property management company for the day-to-day. I did not advertise what I owned. I went to the same grocery store as my neighbors and drove a sensible Subaru, and nobody would have looked at me twice. My daughter's mother-in-law had looked at me once. I remembered it clearly. The first Christmas after the engagement. She had looked me over in that particular way some women do, cataloging, assessing, placing, and then she had turned to speak to someone more interesting. I had watched her move through that room, working it, touching shoulders, laughing at the right moments, and I had thought, she is very good at this. And then I had eaten my dinner and gone home and thought nothing more about it. That was 4 years ago. I had spent 2 years thinking nothing more about it. Then my daughter called me from her office bathroom in tears because her mother-in-law had told a client, in front of her, that my daughter's ideas were charming but a little out of her depth. I had started paying closer attention. My daughter stayed in the guest room. My grandson came back to her 3 days later, not because of any legal intervention, but because my son-in-law, to his partial credit, had refused to go along with the extended arrangement once he understood that his wife was not, in fact, coming back to beg. He drove our grandson to Oakville himself. He stood in my front hallway with his hands in his pockets and said he was sorry and that things had gotten out of hand. I offered him coffee. He said no thank you. He left. I watched my daughter sit on the kitchen floor and let my grandson crawl into her lap, his arms around her neck, her face pressed into his hair, and I thought, now I finish what I started building. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I don't lie awake, imagining disasters for people who've wronged me. Life is too short and sleep is too precious. But I am also, at 63 years old, a woman who has learned the difference between letting something go and letting someone get away with it. And there is a difference. A real one. What her mother-in-law had done wasn't just unkind. It was calculated. The HR complaint, the conversation with the family lawyer, the removal of my grandson from his mother's care before my daughter had time to think clearly. All of it sequenced, deliberate. This was not a woman acting from emotion. This was a woman who had decided to eliminate a threat and had done so efficiently. I respected the competence. I did not accept the outcome. I'd been quietly building my own file for 14 months. It had started with a conversation with my accountant, who also happened to do the books for 2 other property owners in the Calgary commercial corridor. People who had done business with my daughter's mother-in-law's firm over the years and had, in separate and unconnected moments, mentioned things that interested me. Nothing dramatic. A lease reassignment that had gone through in a way that benefited the firm's own portfolio. A maintenance contract that had been awarded to a company that shared a director with the firm. Small things, each of them explainable on their own, interesting when laid side by side. I had a friend who practiced real estate law in Toronto. We'd known each other since the early 90s, back when we were both navigating the particular challenge of being taken seriously in rooms full of men. I had called her and asked her what she thought. She thought it was worth looking at more carefully. It took 8 months of careful looking. What we found wasn't criminal. I want to be precise about that. It was not fraud. But it was the kind of thing that, when presented to a regulatory body that oversaw property management licensing in Alberta and simultaneously to 2 institutional investors who sat on the board of a fund that had a significant position in the firm, the kind of thing that prompts questions. Uncomfortable questions asked by people with fiduciary obligations and lawyers of their own. I did not contact anyone yet. I waited. I waited because my daughter needed to stabilize first, and because my son-in-law needed to understand, slowly and on his own terms, what kind of woman his mother actually was. I waited because I had learned over 63 years that the right moment is not the first moment. The right moment came on a Wednesday in March. My daughter had, by then, found a position with a competing firm, smaller, privately owned, based in Edmonton, but with ambitions. They had been trying to break into the Calgary residential market for 2 years, and they had hired my daughter because she knew every client, every building, every relationship that her former employer had built. She had not taken any proprietary information. She had simply walked out with what was inside her own head, which was considerable. Her mother-in-law had heard about the new job through the industry, the way people in small industries always hear things, and had apparently called my son-in-law to discuss it at some length. He called my daughter after and said, "She's worried." My daughter said, "Good." That was the moment I knew she was going to be all right. 2 days later, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the Alberta Real Estate Council, where I submitted a request for a regulatory review along with the documentation my lawyer and I had compiled. The second was to an investor relations contact at the fund, a woman I had met at a conference in Banff 6 years ago and stayed in touch with. I told her I had some information she might want to have before the firm's next board review and suggested we have coffee. The third call was to a journalist at the Calgary Herald who covered business and had written several pieces about consolidation in the property management sector. I didn't tell him anything directly. I told him there might be a story developing and that he should pay attention to the regulatory filings over the next few weeks. Then I drove home, made myself a cup of tea, and watched the news. I should tell you about my son-in-law. He is not a bad man. I want to say that plainly, because it would be easy to make him a villain, and he isn't one. He is a man who grew up inside his mother's orbit and learned very early that her approval was easier to have than her disapproval, and he built his whole interior life around that lesson without ever quite realizing he'd done it. He loved my daughter. He still loves my daughter, but he had never, in their 5 years of marriage, fully understood that loving her and protecting her were not the same thing. The week after I made my phone calls, he came to Oakville again. This time, he accepted the coffee. He sat at my kitchen table, and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Did you do something?" I said, "I shared some information with some people who I thought should have it." He was quiet for a while. "She's going to lose the license," he said. "They're pulling their investment. The whole board it's bad." "Yes," I said, "I imagine it is." He looked at his hands. He looked out the window. He looked at me. "Why didn't you just tell her to stop?" he said. "Why didn't you just call her to stop?" he said. "Why didn't you just call her and tell her to leave my wife alone?" I thought about that for a moment. I gave him the honest answer. "Because she wouldn't have," I said, "and we both know that." He didn't argue. He couldn't. He had watched his mother operate for 37 years, and he knew what she did when someone tried to simply ask her to stop. "What happens now?" he said. "That depends on you," I said. "Not on me, and not on her. On you." He drove back to Calgary that evening. I don't know exactly what happened when he walked into his mother's house, because I wasn't there and neither was my daughter, and some things are not mine to know. I know that he called my daughter 3 hours later and that they talked for 2 hours, and that by the end of it they had agreed to try again. With the couples counselor, neither of them had ever met who didn't know his mother and had no stake in any of it. I know that my grandson came for Easter and ate approximately his body weight in chocolate eggs and fell asleep on the couch with his shoes still on. I know that my daughter came into the kitchen while I was washing up and stood beside me for a minute and didn't say anything. And then she said, "You knew, didn't you, when you came to get me? You already had a plan." I handed her a dish towel. "I had the beginning of one," I said. She dried a plate. She put it in the cabinet. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to stand up first," I said, "on your own, with your own job and your own ground under your feet. If I'd handed you a rescue, you'd have spent the rest of your life wondering if you needed one." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a very complicated way to love someone," she said. "Yes," I said. "I know. Her mother-in-law's firm went through a restructuring that spring. The licensing review took 6 months and resulted in a formal reprimand and new oversight conditions that the firm had never previously operated under. 2 of their largest institutional clients moved their contracts to other managers. The founder stepped back from the day-to-day, which was described in the industry press as a planned transition to an advisory role, which is what they always say. My son-in-law took over operations. He is better at it than his mother was, or at least better at the parts that require actually listening to people. He hired a new head of client relations, It isn't my daughter. She has her own career now, and it's going well. But it's someone competent, and the firm is slowly rebuilding. I don't know if my daughter's mother-in-law has ever connected the dots back to me. I suspect she has. She is an intelligent woman, but she has never called me, and I have never called her, and when we are in the same room, which does happen, because children share parents whether the parents like it or not, we are perfectly civil to each other in the way that two women can be when they have both understood exactly where they stand. I pass her the butter. She thanks me. We watch my grandson climb the furniture and terrorize the dog. That is enough. I am 63 years old. I have buried a husband and built a business and raised a daughter who, when she was standing at the lowest point she could imagine, sent me 3 words and trusted that I would come. I did come. I came because that is what mothers do. But here is what I want to say to anyone who is watching this and feeling like what my daughter felt. Like everything has been taken from you by someone who had more power and more connections and less conscience than they had any right to have. Strategy is not coldness. Planning is not cruelty. Taking your time is not the same as doing nothing. The woman who came to door 3 at Pearson with 2 bags and a sleeping child on her hip did not lose because she was weaker. She lost that round because she was alone and unprepared, and she had trusted people who did not deserve it. She is not alone now. She was never really alone, and the ground under her feet is more solid today than her mother-in-law ever knew it could be. That is the part they never see coming. The quiet ones? The ones who drive 40 minutes in the morning without calling ahead because their daughter sent 3 words and that was enough. We were always here. We were always paying attention. If you know someone like that, someone in your corner who shows up and doesn't make a speech about it, you already have more than you think. And if you are that person for someone else, keep going. Quietly. Carefully. With receipts. It matters, even when it doesn't look like it does. Especially then. If this story made you feel something, I'd love to know what you're thinking in the comments. And if there's someone out there who needs to hear that it's not over, share this with them. They'll know who they are. I've thought a lot about what made that morning at Pearson possible. Not the drive, not the phone calls I made later, not the documentation or the lawyer or any of the practical pieces. What made it possible was something that had been built long before any of this happened. Something quiet and internal that I don't think I even had a name for until I was standing in my kitchen watching my daughter dry dishes and finally starting to breathe again. What I know is this: the way things unfold is almost never random. My daughter's mother-in-law didn't lose what she lost because the universe decided to balance some cosmic ledger. She lost it because, over years, she had made a habit of treating people as obstacles. Things to be moved, managed, or removed. She had done it so many times, so successfully, that she stopped being careful about it. She stopped checking whether the people she dismissed might have quiet lives she knew nothing about. That carelessness was not bad luck. It was a consequence, hers, and my daughter didn't survive it because someone rescued her. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I showed up at that airport. I made those phone calls. But my daughter had to choose every single day after that morning to rebuild rather than collapse. She had to take the job in Edmonton. She had to sit across from a couples counselor and say hard things and hear hard things and decide her marriage was worth working on. She had to keep showing up for my grandson even on the days when she was exhausted and frightened and still raw. That was hers. I couldn't do any of it for her, and I wouldn't have even if I could. What I believe after 63 years of watching people is that character is not what you say about yourself. It's what you do when you have every reason not to. My daughter had every reason to fall apart permanently. She had every reason to become bitter or dependent or small. She didn't. That's not luck either. That's who she is, built over years of choices I watched her make, some of which I'd advised against, and some of which were entirely her own. The other thing I've thought about is what it means to act from intelligence rather than impulse. When I started building that file, 14 months before I ever used any of it, I wasn't sure I would use it. I wasn't sure it would matter. What I knew was that walking into any situation with information is better than walking in without it. Preparation isn't aggression. Patience isn't passivity. Knowing when to wait is its own kind of strength. And it's one that gets easier to trust the older you get. If you're paying attention, I am not a perfect woman. I have made decisions I'd revise if I could go back. But I showed up. I paid attention. I took the long view when everyone around me was reacting to the immediate moment. And when the moment came, the right one, not the first one, I acted. That, I think, is what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not that the good always win, because they don't. Not cleanly, and not always. But that how you carry yourself through hard things shapes what becomes possible on the other side. Dignity is not a luxury for easy times. It is a tool. So is patience. So is the quiet, steady practice of knowing what you know and waiting until knowing it matters. My grandson has his mother back. My daughter has her footing. That's everything.